So it's my pleasure to welcome you, and I'm happy to host Roger Berkowitz and Deborah Lipstadt. I'll turn it over to Roger. Roger Berkowitz, I think everyone knows, but is the Associate Professor of Political Studies and Human Rights at Bard College, and the Director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. And I should also add one other sentence, that BGIA has a particularly special relationship with Emory University, and that is the single largest source of students in our program, excluding Bard, obviously. And so we are happy to have an Emory faculty member here. I spoke on a panel at Emory 2 weeks ago, and our staff and their staff travel back and forth between us fairly regularly. They're the political studies faculty. With that, give it to Roger.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure for us to be here at the BGAA building. We've been doing some stuff together with BGAA, and I'm hoping we're going to do some more, especially because we are trying to, as some of you know, we've recently gotten an NEH grant, National Endowment of the Humanities grant, and one of the things that grant will fund is a New York City lecture series to bring more of our programming into the city. So we're very happy about that. I also want to mention that we've also been working with another group, the North Jersey Public Policy Network, and Rhoda Shermer, who runs it, and they are a co-sponsor tonight along with the Human Rights Program at Bard, so it's a pleasure to be working with them. I first became aware of Deborah Lipstadt's work a number of years ago during the David Irving trial, as many of us first did. For those of you who don't know it, and I don't know if you're planning on talking much about it.
But I'll answer questions.
So,
I like to call it the Deborah Lipstadt trial.
The Deborah Lipstadt trial. Well, no, that's a very fair point.
Many people forget.
Yes, I mean, in a way, I've always heard it referred to as the David Irving trial because he was the one we all think was on trial, but that's not the way it works. In England, some of you know, they have a very different libel system than we do. And so it's very easy to sue someone for libel, and then the person sued has to defend themselves. It's not like here where you have to prove libel. Here you have to say, oh, there was no libel. And Professor Lipstadt called Mr. Irving a Holocaust denier, a Hitler partisan wearing blinkers, and other things. And he sued her for libel, and she won because she proved that he was a Holocaust denier, and so that was a very important case, I think, for a lot of people in the United States, and it got a lot of attention, and I think it really it made Professor Lipstadt, it gave her a certain amount of authority on the Holocaust, which was important. Just last year, she published a new book, her fourth book, if I count correctly. A very beautiful and good book, the Eichmann trial, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Adolf Eichmann trial in Israel. It got a lot of attention, deservedly. In circles that I have a tendency to run in, it got a lot of attention in a different way. It was largely not liked, and largely and not because of the first 160 pages, which I think everyone admits are really quite good, telling an account of the capture of Eichmann and the history of him. But the last chapter rereads the Eichmann trial through a rereading of Hannah Arendt's book, The Eichmann in Jerusalem. And I think there's a couple things that I want to say. One is that in one sense, Hannah Arendt's essay, as many of you know, is incredibly controversial. It generated enormous controversy, what some people call a pogrom, when it was originally published. And I have to say, some of the things that you quote about what some people said about it were really awful, and about her. And so it's had its defenders and also many and its critics. I'd have to say that this is one of the most balanced accounts that we have, and so we should be happy with that, and we should thank Professor Lipstadt for that. It gives both sides. In the end, it even embraces the main thesis of the book, as far as I understand it, the banality of evil, which has been criticized by many. And yet, at the same time, the book was also very critical of Hannah Arendt. at a couple moments, it comes very close, and in fact says that she may be an anti-Semite. At one point, and I just thought she says, Professor Lipstadt writes, she may have been subliminally writing for her teacher and lover, the revered philosopher Martin Heidegger, who joined the Nazi Party in 1930, and rejected Jewish professors from the university, where he served as rector, and affirmed Nazi ideals, and never recanted his wartime actions. It accuses her in the end of not thinking, and thus being like Eichmann, which is exactly her criticism of Eichmann, which has upset a lot of people. And she writes of Arendt's personal disdain for Israel that bordered on anti-Semitism and racism. So these are hard critiques, I think, it's fair to say, even though the book also praises Arendt in many ways. They're not all critiques I would ascribe to, but we can have that discussion, and I think it's important to have it. It's a complicated book. It's a thriller. It's a historical biography. It's a Holocaust study. It's a book that I think it's important to talk about at a Hannah Arendt Center. A lot of my colleagues in the Hannah Arendt world were very upset that we are doing this. I have to say, not to their.
That says something about open mind.
It does say something about, well, you want to talk about open-mindedness, we can talk about the academy. The Hannah Arendt Center is actually designed to be not about Hannah Arendt. It's designed to be a center dedicated to thinking in the spirit of Hannah Arendt. Thinking that provokes, inspires, and makes people uncomfortable. Thus, thinking that sets up obstacles to common sense and status quo thinking. Hannah Arendt said once, "There are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is dangerous." It's one of my favorite quotes. She also said that the entire task of her work was to think what we are doing. And that's what the center aspires to do, to bring that spirit of Hannah Arendt to public affairs. We are the part of the Bard Civic Engagement Initiative, and so that's, in that sense, we are an attempt to think about what it means to be a citizen in the modern age. So, I am thrilled that Professor Lipstadt is here. She is the Dorot Professor of Modern Jewish and Holocaust Studies at Emory University. She's the author of 4 books: Beyond Belief, The American Press and the Coming of the Holocaust, 1933 to 1945, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory, and History on Trial, My Day in Court with David Irving, in addition to the Eichmann trial. Her talk today, as I have it, is The Eichmann Trial Through the Prism of Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Questionable Legacy. So please welcome Deborah.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here. I'm sort of tickled that your invitation to me has aroused controversy and opposition, because usually when I go places and there's opposition, it's my friend the Holocaust denier. So this is a different quarter opposing or questioning my visit. I'm delighted to be here. I really am. I know that some of you, because you mentioned it as I came in, have read read the book or read my chapter on Arendt. So I don't want to, repeat it, though some of you haven't, because some of you have said that they haven't. So I'm sort of stuck, and maybe I will summarize it to some extent, and those of you who have read it can feel smart because you'll already know everything I have to say. Basically, a little bit of background. I think that for many people, their primary, if not sole prism through which their view or understanding of the Eichmann trial is refracted is Eichmann in Jerusalem. That's how they know it. That's how they understand it. That's how I first came. Well, it's not true exactly. I remember the trial taking place. I remember the news reports. I remember WABC, WNBC. I remember CBS as well, having segments. It was the first trial to be televised. So having segments, the segments you saw were from the day before, because it was, it was not satellite. I was flown out each night, each afternoon, and played the next day in the United States, London, Germany, other places. So that wasn't obviously my first connection, but my first connection when I sat down to take a scholarly look at it was, of course, Eichmann in Jerusalem. I also moved in circles, both, and the book was in the house, my parents read it, Some friends of theirs read it as well. It was a matter of great discussion. But to be perfectly honest, most of this discussion, certainly early in before I seriously encountered it, was negative, was critical. Not so much in my house as the words, I never heard the word self-hating Jew growing up. Even I came from a very traditional home, very Jewishly affiliated, but I never heard that word. But it was critical of what she had to say about the trial, and critical about what she had to say about the victims. I read it and was very critical when I first read it. Now, when I sat down to write this book, and on some strange level, I'll be happy to talk about that if someone asks at the end, I came to this book, I was asked to do this by the editor of this particular series, and his particular interest in my doing the story of the Eichmann trial was because I had been on trial. And I can say, while it bemuses me and sort of tickles me that there are people who are opposed to my company having given this talk tonight, it drives me nuts to think that there are people who think that David Irving was on trial and that I sued David Irving. I think it's a commentary, because A, I don't believe in suing people for their intellectual and historical beliefs. Second of all, he tried to shut down my freedom of speech. He dragged me through a 7-year legal battle. Cost me close to $2 million. There was a defense fund that wasn't out of my pocket. He upset my life. He turned my life upside down. And for so many good people to think that I sued him is a commentary more on them than on me, and it always intrigues me. But end of harangue on that. We'll have other harangues tonight. So, but when I sat down, the editor asked me to do it because he said, "You've been on trial. You've been on trial. You were sat in a courtroom for 12 weeks on trial." And you will have a different perspective on the Eichmann trial. And Hannah Arendt didn't even figure into the conversation. And I thought that was ludicrous. I thought my being on trial would not affect my perspective on the Eichmann trial at all. Actually, it did. And there were certain parallels and also great differences, but parallels that I saw between David Irving and Adolf Eichmann primarily. I mean, one, of course, destroyed people. The other mangles and destroys history. So that's a major difference. But the parallel was that I saw two deep-seated, deeply committed anti-Semites, and whose lives were, at the period I encountered them, Eichmann at his trial, and David Irving at my trial and in the preparation for the trial, people who the beat of the drummer to which their lives marched was anti-Semitism. But of course, one of the first things I did when I sat down to write about this is I pulled my copy of Eichmann in Jerusalem. I actually had a first edition, which, much to my horror, I discovered I had marked up when I first read. My brother-in-law's an antiquarian bookseller, almost, had a fit. And I reread it, and I discovered it was much more nuanced than I remembered. And that was something I tried, and I actually wrote the Arendt chapter first. It changed greatly by the time the book was published. But I wrote it first because I had to get that out of the way. I did not want to be writing the rest of the book through the perspective of answering Arendt. I didn't want to fall into that trap of saying that her perspective is the only I have the prism through which I'm viewing it is her prism, doubly refracted. So I wrote that chapter, set it aside, and then, of course, came back to it and changed it greatly, just refined it, etc. But one of the things that struck me was that how many things get deleted, how many things get ignored, that she said that, in fact, many of her greatest supporters would be appalled to know that she said. I think of the people who made that horrible film, The Specialist, they would just, I think she would be appalled by that film, and I think, they ignore so much of the other things she said, so I found her much more complicated than I originally remembered her. I was also struck when I started out, and this is how I begin the chapter, by looking at at the reviews of the book when it first came out. There are, of course, those who called it a masterpiece. Dwight MacDonald, who was former editor of Partisan Review and writer for Esquire, a masterpiece of historical journalism, wonderful, etc., etc., brilliant. Stephen Spender described it as brilliant, Robert Lowell, a masterpiece, etc. And then, of course, those at the other end of the spectrum called her a self-hating Jew, called it filled with half-truths, double standards of evidence, etc., etc. And, of course, the war of the intellectuals, many of them, most of them, if not here in New York, are the war of the Jews over this book, Irving Howe's experience and others, really are quite striking. I don't know. I contend that I don't think there's another book. And for a while there, Daniel Jonah Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Execution gave the controversy over Eichmann in Jerusalem a run for its money, so to speak. But I think that has faded, and the controversy over Eichmann in Jerusalem persists. And I was struck in reading the reviews and some of the things that came out of Bart and other places as well, that the critics are angry with me for criticizing her, and or the people who are, which we say in the Arendt camp, are angry with me for criticizing her, and those who think she is the devil incarnate think I was too easy on her. So I tend to think I maybe got it somewhere in right, you know. If nobody is happy, that's good. But in any case, what are some of the things that I say? And I'm going to go through them pretty quickly, and then we can go back, because again, I assume there's some people here who know it. When she decides to go to the trial, first she asks Pahoritz to go to cover it for commentary. And he says no. My guess is he couldn't afford what it would cost. And she, of course, then goes to New Yorker and covers it for them. But one of her reasons for wanting to go, she has a personal feeling. She had missed the Nuremberg trials, and she personally wanted to be there as a German Jew, as someone whose life was so disrupted by whose community was destroyed by the final solution, by the Holocaust. But she also wanted to see it because she wanted to see, in terms of having written The Origins of Totalitarianism, here was a chance to see what she had written about in the flesh. And that wanting to come and see that, or that perspective, immediately put her at odds with Gideon Hausner and the way he perceived of this trial. Now, by the way, there is no evidence that David Ben-Gurion was manipulating things behind the scene. There is absolutely no evidence of that. He did see Hausner's introductory speech, probably only read the first few pages. His only comment was, every time you mention Germany, please say Nazi Germany, so that it wouldn't be confused with contemporary West Germany. And that was his main one or two other comments. But certainly for Gideon Hausner, who is Ben-Gurion didn't have to tell Hausner what to do. They shared a common perspective.
I'll just remind people who Hausner is.
Okay, Hausner's the prosecutor. I'm sorry, Gideon Hausner's the prosecutor. Arendt is very critical of him in Eichmann in Jerusalem. But for Gideon Hausner, for many Israelis, for Ben-Gurion, the perspective on Eichmann was that and on the final solution, not just Eichmann, was that this was a link in the chain of anti-Semitism. Hausner's opening paragraphs in his opening speech, where he says, judges of Israel, today I do not, I'm paraphrasing, today I do not stand with you alone. With me stand 6 million voices, 6 million victims, but their voices cannot be heard, but their blood cries out. Clear biblical, language that he very much picks up the biblical language of the story of Cain and Abel. They cannot cry out Jacques Hughes, Zola. You pick up those things. It's and then he goes on to say, and today we judge someone. We've come to judge someone who we've had Pharaoh in Egypt, Haman in Shushan, Purim just having passed, and Chmielnicki in Poland, and now we have Eichmann here to judge in the final. So in other words, the final solution is a chain in the link of anti-Semitism. That was their perspective. Arendt's perspective was quite different. She thought as a break, something new and something different and something unprecedented in terms of mass tragedies. The irony is, and I get to this later, but I'll say this now, is that the general belief amongst many people who would probably have been in the camp to have criticized her is her perspective. That's why they would argue that there's the need for and legitimate place for a Holocaust museum adjacent to the mall in Washington. That the Holocaust is something different. So that in that way, that historical perspective of hers really has become the perspective to which I would even say most historians see it that way. But certainly even those talking now about people who would have been more critical of her, or would even today be critical of her, that is the perspective that is seen, that is very clearly accepted. When she, I've never described her as anti. I don't think I didn't mean to, as anti-Israel, because I certainly quote. Well, I'll get to that in a minute, where she expresses great concern about Israel. But when she first comes to Israel. And she'd been there before, but when she first comes for the trial, and in letters that she writes both to Mary McCarthy and to Carl Jaspers, her teacher, good friend, she says things that border on, and I said, border on anti-Semitism and border on racism. There's no question of that. Let me read you some of them. She talked about the Payas, Payas and Kaftan Jews, in other words, the ultra-Orthodox, who make life impossible for all reasonable people here. She talked about she describes for Karl Jaspers, the judges were the best of German Jewry, while Hausner was, quote, a typical Galician Jew, one of those people who doesn't know any languages. Now I want to just point out that Gideon Hausner was conducting the trial in Hebrew, Yiddish, English, German. Probably he knew Polish. He grew up in Poland. He may have known Lithuanian, some other Eastern European languages, etc. What she probably meant is his German wasn't perfect. So if your German's not perfect, you didn't know any languages. But she says about him, he spoke, quote, without periods or commas, like a diligent schoolboy who wants to show off everything he shows. He has a ghetto mentality. So I mean, it's that he was sometimes a peacock when he presented things, absolutely. That he overdid it. That at times, you wanted to say to him, "Stop! You've made your point." As you read the transcript clearly, but to talk about some of the ghetto mentality is quite striking. Moreover, she also talks about, she shows particular contempt for the Sephardic or Middle Eastern Jews. At that point, many Israeli policemen were of Sephardic origin. It was a way out of lower classes, it was a good job, etc. And many were, not all, but many were. And she writes, she talks about them as she calls them the Oriental Jews, and she writes, an Oriental mob that would hang, well here's now she's not talking about the policemen, I'll get to that in a minute. An Oriental mob that would hang around any place where something is going on is hanging around in front of the courthouse. She felt this, she writes to Jaspers, I feel as if I'm in Istanbul or some other half-Asiatic country. And here's what she talks about the Israeli police. Everything is organized by a police force that gives me the creeps, speaks only Hebrew and looks Arabic. Some downright brutal types among them, they would obey any order. Now, when I read that, it just pulled me up. She's going into a trial whose the defense of the individual on trial is that he was obeying orders. And to use that kind of term in that relation, you may think that the police were terrible or whatever, but it was just quite striking. And she said other things, of course, some of which were even worse. She gets some things wrong. She talks about the pro-Zionist policy of the Nazis. And she even talks about when they wanted to send the Jews to Madagascar. That was one of the plans that never materialized. That this was an example of their pro-Nazi policy. Now, what she ignores or didn't know or didn't bother to find out, and as a historian I was really quite struck at how many things she didn't bother to find out, some of which were readily known at that time, was that Madagascar was a form of extermination, of annihilation. It was a jungle island, with very little habitable land on it. Certainly very little for a European-born, raised population who would be sent there without anything, and it would have been a slow death. And that was essentially what the Germans had planned. And in fact, it was very clear early on in the 30s, when the policy of the Nazis, before the policy becomes annihilation and murder, when the policy is to push them out of German-controlled territory, that there was concern about how many were going to Palestine, how many were going to the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, because again, it was creating a community of too many Jews together. And that was the Germans saw that as dangerous. There was real opposition to that. So to talk about a pro-Zionist policy, I think, is an overstatement of fact. But it's in her critique of the Judenrat, the Jewish councils, that things really exploded. And she devotes, I would say, about 10 pages to it. But the comments she makes. And you can't excuse, well, some people have said to me, including you, but we won't. Well, it's only 10 pages, so how could she deal with it definitely? If you're going to deal with a topic like this and say the things you're going to say, then it calls for, I think, a much greater nuance than she gives it. What she says, essentially, is, and this is the quote for which she is most skewered by people. If the Jewish people had been really unorganized and leaderless, there would have been chaos and misery, but the total number of victims would hardly have been between 4.5 and 6 million. She talks about the pathetic and sordid behavior of the Judenrat was the darkest chapter of the Holocaust, darker than the mass shootings, darker than the gas chambers, etc. Now, when I first read that, I was just, disgusted by it. When I went back and read it this time, having read Origins of Totalitarian, and once again much more closely, I understood also more clearly what she was saying there, in that the ability of a totalitarian regime to turn people against people is something that is the most sordid part of what totalitarian regimes can do. Yet to say, to talk about them as instruments of murder, or to say that there would have been fewer Jews killed, is also to ignore history. There weren't Judenrat in the Eastern territories in the Soviet Union, where you had the mass shootings, and you had a tremendous number of deaths. You had well over a million, probably 1.5 million. Some people now think it's even higher. Deaths there. So to say that these Jews were responsible for the deaths of the Jews who were killed in the ghettos is, I think, an overly strong statement. She does raise an important question about, she said, to fail to question this is, she makes notes at one point when she's about to give a lecture at Wesleyan, if you say to yourself in such matters, such as the Judenrat, who am I to judge, you are already lost. And there is a reluctance, I would say, amongst many people, many fine historians, to judge. I don't know if historians should be judging, but to judge people who were in these circumstances that you can never fully understand. But I think she does raise some important questions about their making up the lists of who would get on the trains and who wouldn't, etc. So, and there is much criticism. There was criticism by the Jews in the ghetto, the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Jews who were involved in the rebellion in the Warsaw Ghetto hated the Judenrat in the Warsaw Ghetto, and in fact, they wanted, when Hausner came to two of the leaders, Sylvia Lubetka Zuckerman and her husband, to come and give testimony, Antek Zuckerman, to come and give testimony at the trial, they said, you must tell the whole story, including the story of the Judenrat. Now, I think one of the things that ticked her off, that really upset her, was that Hausner didn't bring up the topic of the Judenrat at the trial. It's Benjamin Halevi, one of the judges, who brings it up. For Hausner was really conducting this trial with another trial lurking in his very clear memory, and that was the Kastner trial, which had taken place a number of years before, in the early 50s, in Israel. It was a trial where Israel Kastner, a Hungarian Jew who had negotiated with Eichmann, in the Trucks for Lives, and Trucks to Barter for Jews' Lives, sued another Hungarian Jew for libel for having said that he was a collaborator. And what upset many people, including Hausner, was that trial became in Israel a trial of the victims, where the Jews were on trial, essentially, what they did and how they responded. And Hausner was intent on ensuring that this trial was not a trial of the victims, but this was a trial of the perpetrators. So he ignores that topic. Now, for some reason, Arendt says that he ignores it because Ben-Gurion doesn't want him to embarrass Adenauer and West Germany and the Germans. Now, Ben-Gurion was very sensitive to what Adenauer thought because he was trying to develop closer relations for Israel and Germany, and that was very controversial in Israel at that point. Many people were strongly opposed to that. But how raising the topic of the Jewish councils would have embarrassed Adenauer, in fact, if anything, it would have been succor to the Germans. They would say, see, you're attacking us, attack the Jews who collaborated as well. So it's a strange statement that she makes. Another strange statement that she makes is when she writes about Leo Baeck. Leo Baeck, the leading Reform rabbi of Berlin, who had a number of chances to get out of Germany. Could have come to Hebrew Union College here, Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati tried to bring him. He could have gotten to London, and he refused. He refused to leave because he didn't want to leave his congregation, his people, his flock, so to speak. Finally, in late 42 or in early 43, I forget exactly when, they come to arrest him. Gestapo comes and he asks them to wait so that he can pay his light bills or his utility bills. That's pretty. Get a lot those unpaid. And so he could write a letter to his daughter who was in London. He's taken to Theresienstadt, the camp outside of Prague in Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic. And he knows that the Jews who are being deported from Terezin are being taken to Auschwitz to their death. He doesn't tell them. And he doesn't tell them because he thinks to tell them would make their pain even worse. And that's something to debate. That's something to debate. Not to judge, maybe, but to debate, to discuss, to wonder, was that right? Who gave him the right to keep that information? It was a judgment call on his. It may have been a wrong judgment call, because there may have been some people who wouldn't have gotten on the train, who would have done something, But where Arendt goes overboard is she calls him the Jewish Führer. Now, where did she get that? And here's where she really gets to a certain degree in trouble, and I'm not going to go into this whole piece. The late Raoul Hilberg does it in great detail in his memoir. In his book, in Destruction of European Jewry, Hilberg writes about Baeck, that Baeck, whom Eichmann's men called the Jewish Führer, ... Arendt leaves out this phrase, Eichmann's men called, and just describes him as the Jewish Führer. Now, I think that is so over the top that you have to wonder what's going on. Why would someone use that? Why would someone say that? And of course, Hilberg's great upset was that he felt that she had lifted many things from his work, many facts from his history, which she probably did without crediting him, and then in the end goes on to attack him for his perspective. She's also wrong on Yechiel Dinur, Katsetnik, who, as he was known. He was an Israeli. He was a writer in Israel. He's the one who faints, who collapses at the trial. Actually goes into a coma for 2 weeks, and hovers between life and death, and then does survive. And she writes about him. Let me just find it. He comes on into the witness box, and he was a writer of books that were close to pornographic, kind of. They were these cheap sellers that would be sold in newsstands, and he took, his name was Yechiel Dinur, he took as his pen name Katsetnik, concentration camp name. And he gets into, first he asks the judge's permission to testify under his pseudonym, under his Katsetnik, and they refuse. They say, you can't do that, it's a trial, you got to testify under your real name. And then he begins to launch into descriptions. The planet Auschwitz, the inhabitants had no name, they did not dress as we dress here. And he's essentially paraphrasing what he says in his books. And the judges stop him and say, excuse me, you got to answer questions. This is not a time for speeches, etc. And he faints, he collapses. And if you've ever seen the video, they're up on YouTube, many of the videos of the trial, and the video of him collapsing. It's really, I watch it many times. It's almost like someone just pulled the plug out from under him, and he just crumbles. And this is how Arendt describes the moment. He started off, as he had done at many of his public appearances, with an explanation of his adopted name. He continued with a little excursion into astrology. When he arrived at the unnatural power above nature which had sustained him, even Mr. Hausner felt something had to be done about this testimony, she puts in question marks, and very timidly, very politely interrupted him. Whereupon the presiding judge saw his chance as well. First, Hausner says, excuse me, may I ask you some questions? And then the presiding judge pushes even further, whereupon the presiding judge saw his chance as well. In response, the disappointed witness, probably deeply wounded, fainted and answered no more questions. And he just fainted, he went to a coma. And it's covered in the Israeli press. I mean, I read the Israeli press, and they talk about how he's hovering, he's in terrible shape. Second of all, she attacks him for he had no connection, no direct connection to Eichmann. What was he doing there to testify? Actually, he had met Eichmann. He had a South American passport, and he was arrested, and he said to Eichmann, I have this passport, and Eichmann took it from him in Florida. So he had encountered Eichmann. Not only had he encountered Eichmann and seen Eichmann, but he had a personal encounter about his own experience with Eichmann. Well known. And yet her depiction of him, she gets it all. Shoshana Feldman, my colleague, whose work many of you I'm sure know, writes about this segment very, very powerfully in an essay of hers. So that's another point where she gets, I think, something quite wrong. The last point I want to make in terms of critique of her is, of course, on Eichmann's anti-Semitism. Where she wants to fit him, I believe, she wants to fit him into the model of the totalitarian regime, which gets people to do things even though they may not fully believe in them, and etc. Well, I guess the best person to cite on this is Christopher Browning, whose book is a terrific book. It's classic. It's been a classic in the 25 years it's been out. Ordinary Men. If you've never read it, you should really read it. And very much that's adopting Arendt's perspective, where he talks about Police Battalion 101, and how they are turned almost overnight into killers, having lived in this society. And it's really an Arendt perspective on the perpetrators. And Chris Browning says quite clearly she's fooled by Eichmann. Hannah Arendt was fooled, and that's a quote. Fooled by Eichmann, that when she just concluded that he had showed no fanatical anti-Semitism, that he didn't have an insane hatred of Jews, etc. She's completely wrong. But this is a man who maybe he didn't start out a fanatical anti-Semite, but by the time he gets to Vienna in '38, and he's overseeing the dissolution of the Austrian Jewish community, the Viennese Jewish community, he is certainly a committed anti-Semite, and I think she just is fooled by them. Of course, part of the problem is she's not there. She's not in the courtroom when Eichmann takes the stand. She's not in the courtroom when he goes head-to-head with Hausner. And many of the reporters who were there for the whole time are just transfixed by those moments. They talk about seeing a side of him that they hadn't seen up until that point. And the flashes of anger. And now she was summary. She was meeting her husband and Mary McCarthy in Europe, and they actually went to visit Heidegger, which struck me as quite striking. Many people say, oh, she wrote this because of Heidegger. I don't fully believe that, but I think at that moment, that she goes and meets Heidegger then when she's coming from the trial, it's quite striking. That she didn't see that, I think, is should have been acknowledged. Should have been stated. You would think the New Yorker, with its fact checking, would have at least, because she begins the book. Doesn't the book begin with Beit HaMishpat, which is the House of Justice, which is what in America we say all rise. In England, and in Israel they say Beit HaMishpat, which means rise. And she says, I went to Jerusalem to cover this.
She also says, I stayed for 3 weeks and then I came back for a week. She says,
but she doesn't acknowledge that she isn't there at that critical moment when Eichmann is on the stand. I think that's quite striking. Now let me turn to the other side, because that's not the only perspective I have. She says some things that I think are exceptionally powerful. First of all, when she talks about Eichmann as a small cog, and he wasn't such a small cog, but she says it's immaterial. When you have a machine, take out a small cog, take out a large cog, the machine's going to stop operating. And I still have people say, well, it was just a small cog. I say, okay, I'm taking out a small little bolt from your car. No, I think she's right on the perpetrators not being monsters. I think she got that so right, and that's such an important contribution to study of the final solution. I also was deeply touched and deeply moved when she hated Abba Kovner's testimony, and I can understand with good reason. Abba Kovner was the leader of the Vilna Ghetto resistance. But even more striking, Abba Kovner was the first person, not the first Jew, the first person we know of in Europe, December 41, January 42, at the very end, we don't know exactly what day, to call for armed uprising against the Nazis. And he leads the uprising in the Vilna Ghetto, which fails, is put down very quickly. He goes to the forest, joins a Soviet partisan group, fights with them. But when the war is over, he stays in Germany and tries to poison the bread and poison the water supply at some point, or poison the bread that's being given to SS officers in a camp. Ben-Gurion hears about this, gets him out of there very quickly, comes to Israel, he joins a kibbutz where he works the land, and he becomes one of Israel's leading poets. So from the Israeli perspective, he is, a fighter, a man of the soil, and a man of letters. I mean, they don't come. He really was nobility in terms of Israel. He comes and gives testimony, and again, he does not give testimony. And in fact, the judges hate his testimony. Not just Arendt who hates his testimony. When Kovner steps down from the stand, the judges lay into Hausner. Saying, how could this can't happen, and you've got to ask questions, and you can't let people hijack their, because Kovner gives this speech about what it was like, etc., etc. But at one point in his testimony, he tells the story of Anton Schmidt. And Anton Schmidt was a German sergeant who was so appalled by what the Germans were doing in Vilna, he was stationed in Vilna, that he secretly helped the Jewish resistance. He got them arms, he got them uniforms, he got them ammunition, he got them money, and he would take nothing in return. The resistance tried to give him, he would take nothing in return. He did this for a number of months, and then was caught and shot. And Arendt, remember, she hates Kovner's testimony, but this is how she describes this moment in Kovner's testimony. A hush settled over the courtroom. It was as though the crowd had spontaneously decided to observe the usual 2 minutes of silence in honor of the man named Anton Schmidt. And in those 2 minutes, which were like a sudden burst of light in the midst of impenetrable, unfathomable darkness, a single thought stood out, clearly, irrefutable, beyond question. How utterly different everything would be today in this courtroom, in Israel, in Germany, in all of Europe, and perhaps in all the countries of the world, if only more such stories could have been told. And on some level, that's the essence of the Holocaust, of the Shoah. That if there had been, 10,000 Anton Schmidts, things would have been very different. And then she goes on a few pages thereafter where she's talking about Denmark and Bulgaria, both of which saved their Jews. She says, most people will comply, and she puts it she puts the next phrase in italics, but some people will not. And then she goes on to say, the final solution could have happened in most places, but it did not happen everywhere. And then she says, humanly speaking, no more is required can reasonably be asked for this planet to remain a place fit for human habitation. It's a very strong statement. She offers what Norman Podhoretz, who is mercilessly critical of her, describes as the most severe criticism of West Germany heard this side of the Iron Curtain. When she says, Israel had to go looking for Eichmann. In Germany, you don't have to go looking. They were both there. Adenauer's chief of staff was a man named Hans Globke, who wrote the Nuremberg laws. I mean, he didn't create the idea, but he wrote the laws. And he also was the man who, when the Germans decided that Jews had to add, Sarah or Isaac to their middle name, and any document, if you got a letter that was not addressed Deborah, Sarah, Lipstadt, if you didn't have that in your name, if you were a Jew, it wasn't a legal document. You couldn't get a letter, nothing. Mailman wouldn't deliver a letter, bank wouldn't handle anything, nothing. But the only exception were for people with overtly Jewish names. And it's Globke who makes up the list of overtly Jewish names. So I sort of see him sitting in his study and saying, Mendel, overtly Jewish, something not so, et cetera, et cetera. He's Adenauer's chief of staff. That was one of the reasons Adenauer was not at all interested in having this trial in Germany. Because all he was afraid of, I don't say, you're trying me? Let me point out who's this Globke and this one and that one, etc. So, she said she's fiercely critical of Adenauer in West Germany. And I think that gets lost very often in the criticism. And there are other things as well. I think one of the other things, she captures the importance of this trial, the significance of this trial, when she writes that this trial was for the first time since the year 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, Jews were able to sit in judgment on crimes committed against their own persons. For the first time, they did not need to appeal to others for protection and justice, or fall back upon the compromised phraseology of the rights of man. Rights which, as no one knew better than they, were claimed only by people who were too weak to defend their rights and enforce their own laws. You don't need to cry rights of man if you have you have laws that you can enforce and judges who can, and an army, etc., etc. What I write in the next sentence is, Ben-Gurion, for whom Israel represented the Jewish emergence from powerlessness, could not have stated matters more forcefully. It's very striking. It's very, very striking. Her comment that this was a show trial doesn't, if you read the transcripts, which I have read both in Hebrew and then I use the translations, of course, in English, if the judges are critical and hard on anyone in that courtroom, it's on Gideon Hausman. You're bringing witnesses who have no connection, you're asking immaterial questions, etc., etc., number one. Number two, Eichmann never stands at show trial. We're talking 61 after the Stalinist show trials. The show trial means you go in and you say, I did it. I'm wrong, punishment. Eichmann never acknowledges that he says, yes, I did it. No Nazi war criminals ever denied that it happened. They denied maybe that they did it or denied that they had a choice. One of the most powerful moments, in fact, comes, to move away just from Arendt for a moment, and I'm going to stop in a second or two so we do have time for questions and comments and discussion, comes at the end of the trial. In Israeli courtrooms, especially the very few capital trials, there have been just a few in all of Israel's history. Of course, Eichmann is the only person. Two people have been found sentenced to death in Israel's history. Eichmann, anybody know the second one? Dumyanyu, John Dumyanyu. and in a tremendous credit to Israel's judicial system. There's an automatic appeal. It's not the tremendous credit, but I'll get to that in a minute. There's an automatic appeal in a capital case in Israel. And this is the only law which has the death sentence, the Nazis and their collaborators. So when the case went to the High Court, to Beit Mishpat Elyon, the judge, there was some question about one of the documents identifying Dunyanyuk as Ivan the Terrible. And the person who had identified him was no longer alive, so he couldn't be questioned. So the judges say, very much paraphrasing here Jewish law, that there was some question whether it was entirely correct that he was Ivan the Terrible. But there was no question that he was Ivan the very, very, very horrible. And they don't say it that way. But they say it's clear that you did terrible things, you did horrible things, but we don't know if you were Ivan the Terrible. And that's what you were brought here and charged with. And in a democracy, you can't bring someone for the rape of one woman and you say, well, we can't prove that rape, but we know he raped someone else. That wasn't the charge. He can't be charged. And they let him go. So 2 people have been sentenced and one's death penalty has been carried out. And Arendt, in fact, supported the death penalty. She supported also having the trial in Israel. When Jasper said the trial shouldn't be in Israel, how can he get a fair trial? She points out, after the war there were trials in Poland and there were trials in Czechoslovakia, and no one said, how can those trials be fair? How come now when it's Jews we ask that they're not fair? She thought he should be sentenced for this new and unprecedented crime, but she still supported the death penalty. Which even some of the witnesses at the trial, and Gershom Shalom, which of course with whom she's going to have a great contretemps after the publication of her book, doesn't support the death penalty. So it's not so clear. It's much more complicated, I think, than some people would have it in the what she says and how she says it. I think she got some things terribly wrong. I think she got some things very, very right. I think at times she's unnecessarily cruel. She's cruel about the Sonderkommandos, where the people who worked the Jews who worked in the gas chambers, where she says, oh, they were criminals, so it was all right. How does she put it? The actual work of killing was done by the Sonderkommandos, but then she says cavalierly, this was no moral problem because the SS chose criminal elements for the job. There's no proof of that. In fact, we know people who were Sonderkommandos who were not criminals. We know many of the people who were on. She just throws that out there. And Primo Levi texted her many years ago. I can't prove that he's writing to her, but it certainly sounds that when Primo Levi writes, no one is authorized to judge them, not even those who lived through the experience of the lager, and even less those who did not live through it. I would invite anyone who dares to pass judgment to imagine, if he can, that he has lived for months or years in a ghetto, tormented by chronic hunger, fatigue, promiscuity, and humiliation, that he has seen die around him one by one his beloved, that he is cut off from the world, unable to receive or transmit news, that finally is loaded on a train, 80 or 100 persons to a boxcar, that he travels towards the unknown blindly for sleepless days and night, and that he is thrown at last inside the walls of an indecipherable inferno. I am convinced that Primo Levi is writing to Hannah Arendt's comment on that. And there's no proof that they were criminal, and if they were criminal elements, etc. So there are things she got terribly wrong, but there are some things that she got, I think that she captured, and she captured very, very well. So she's a complicated character, and I think those of you who study her and know her should be willing to admit that as well. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much. And I know there's a lot of people here who knew Arendt, who know her work, and there's probably questions. But I want to, what I don't want, at least right now, to do is go through one by one or any of this. I think that a number of the points Professor Lipstadt makes are good, critical of Arendt. I think some of them were overstated in my view, and we can, if there are questions, let's do that then. I don't want to sort of go point by point. One thing that I thought was interesting was you mentioned the height of the controversy around this book, and you compared it to the Goldhagen book, which has faded. Well, it's faded because it was a terrible book, whereas Browning's book's an excellent book. Arendt's book's still with us because it's a book that thousands of people every year read and reread, because it's one of the most thoughtful and provocative books that we have of the 20th century. Certainly about the Holocaust, if not the most, in many people's views. And so it's important for us to keep that in mind, that this is a book that people have been talking about now for 51 years, or 50 years. Came out in 61 in the paper, right?
No later.
63, yeah, so almost.
It was printed in the New Yorker before.
Right, so
But it's also
63 in the New Yorker. And so it's a book that I teach almost every year. I will tell you, there's very few other books that you can have students read that get them so engaged and provoked and thoughtful. I think it's a brilliant book. And what I say when people get into these controversies, what I always say is the title of the thing I wrote about it: just go read the book, right? And that's what I first want to say. So I want to make a couple of points. Again, not tit for tat, but
I'm ready.
No, but I'll let them.
I have faced far worse than you or anybody else. You don't scare me a whit.
I'll believe that. But I think there are some interesting and important questions that are raised, and I want to bring.
I want to hear.
And I want to go into those rather than this and that. Professor Lipstadt has a theme in her book, which is vibrant, and it's very much against Hannah Arendt, and it's the importance of survivor testimony. As she says, Hannah Arendt was not pleased with the choice of the whether you want to call it Ben Gurion or Hauser to make the case about an educational event as opposed to a trial. She thought it should have been a trial. And by the way, she's certainly not the only person who thought so. All the judges were appalled by that decision as well. But there are two moments in the book that really stood out for me. One at the very, very beginning, the first page actually, where you're talking about your work with the Holocaust Museum. And I'm going to tell the story quickly, and you tell me if I get it wrong. But the Holocaust Museum in Washington, Professor Lipstadt was on a committee to help design it or help.
I was just present when it was that.
Or present, okay. And there was a controversy over whether to have hair as one of the exhibits, and hair harvested from women, I believe, in the Holocaust. And the committee originally chose to display it. And after a bunch of controversy, a number of survivors came through and opposed that decision. And at one particular meeting, one of them said, "That could have been my mother's hair. She never gave you permission to display it." And in the words that you write following that, quote, "The conversation soon ended. There was no vote, but all those present knew that the decision had been made. As one member said, 'I don't object to the hair. Who am I to challenge the survivors?'"
But let me just add one thing on that. Another argument also was made by feminists, including many women, not just women, but staff members at the museum, who thought it was objectifying women by displaying their hair. So I thought that was also
People made arguments on both sides. Later in the book, at the very end of the chapter on Arendt, you're discussing Chaim Rumkowski. Chaim Rumkowski was one of the Judenräte, one of the Jewish council leaders. I have a very different view of her discussion of the Judenräte in the book. I think it's one of the more important and powerful sections of the book, and I'm happy to talk about that later. But Chaim Rumkowski is someone who made a very particular decision to give up the elderly and children in order to save, let's say, on the one hand, other people, and on the other, his family and friends.
It wasn't just his family.
It wasn't just, but it included his family and friends. So here's a leader, right, who made a choice to, as he said, cut off the limbs to save the body.
Well,
That's a quote, right?
That's right. He does say that. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, and what I thought was interesting is that you say at one point,
early on, you had a similar view of him as a sort of a bad...
Well, the view I have, because some of you may know Fiedler's, I think it's Fiedler's book, King of the Jews, King of the Ghetto. Is it King of the Jews, King of the Ghetto? Rukowski is this very complicated character. There's actually a very good film, documentary on him. He lives in splendor, and not splendor, but he wears a fur-lined coat. He even had stamps printed with his picture on them that Germans wouldn't let him use them. He lived very well, while other people in the ghetto did not. His decision to give up the elderly and the young was not just family and friends, though he did, those people were saved as well. But he wanted to turn the Lodz ghetto into a contemporary side of a lean, mean operating machine. It would be so valuable to the Germans that they wouldn't be able to destroy it. And the fact is, the historical fact is, and I'll let you finish in a minute, but just to add this, is that the Lodz ghetto is the last ghetto to be destroyed. It's destroyed in August 1944. The Soviets are not far away. And if the Soviets moved in that direction, that ghetto would have been liberated with 40 to 50,000 people in it. And Rukowski would be a hero. And I tell the story, if I can I add that to the story?
Well, I have
you have it, so you can tell it.
Well, I think that claim that he would be a hero is one that I wouldn't counter.
Maybe.
But that's why we have a meaningful debate. But what I found is that you, at least as you presented in the book, originally had this sort of negative view of him.
Absolutely.
Until you're confronted, as you tell it, by a survivor who rebuked you, saying, "By me, he is a hero. I'm alive because of him." To which you add, "I was silent."
Mm-hmm.
Now, both of these are moments in the text that I found very illustrative because the whole premise of Arendt's book, right, is that we have to face the horrors of what happened. And for her, the horror of what happened is, on the one hand, the Holocaust, that 6 million, that number or less, Jews were killed. But for her, even more horrifying than that was that it was done mostly by the fact there were brutal and anti-Semitic people around, and anti-Semitism but it was allowed to happen because so many people didn't stand up like Anton Schutz and say, "No, I can't do this," and so for her, the basic premise of Eichmann in Jerusalem as a book and as her argument is that we have to face up to the real horror of it is. And the real horror of it is that a lot of normal people participated in this. And no one wants to talk about that.
Oh, I don't know that that's...
Well, now they do.
I think that Shaul Friedlander makes the point in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Years of Extermination, in the introduction, very powerfully. He says, there was not, and of course I'm paraphrasing, there was not one institution in Europe, religious, cultural, political, that spoke out on behalf of the Jews.
But why the uproar around this book? We have all these things, the Judenrechte, the facts, this, but the uproar was because she didn't call Eichmann a monster. That's what the uproar was about.
I don't agree.
Okay.
I don't agree. I would think it was more about...
That's still what people... when I confront people in the streets or in parties...
No, well...
Yeah, I know.
Maybe it was around this book. There was once a great cartoon in the New Yorker. I forget how it was set up. But it's a New York City cocktail party. You can see out the window, New York City landmarks, and people are talking about a book and saying, "Oh, this, that, and the other." And then there's one little nebbishy guy in the middle somehow got invited to the party, and he said, "But I read the book, and it doesn't say that." And the next panel, he's completely by himself. Everybody is fine. So I think the people who say that she didn't call him a monster, I think. And having read the criticism, because I paid a lot of attention, because I start the book by looking at the praise and looking at the criticism. The criticism, I think, mainly was around the union.
Okay. My point is that when I've gone to Holocaust memorial museums, there's nothing more powerful than seeing hair. Nothing more powerful than seeing eyeglasses or clothes, right, shoes.
Right.
that's what it means to me to face the horror. To stand up and say, being nice and saying, let's not, might have been my mother's hair, or feminist concerns. No, we have to tell the truth, and we have to put that out there and confront the horror. That's what Arendt did. And I think, and I think it's very important that she did that. And there's a way in which, even though you come to agree with her in a sense about the banality of evil, I find in the book a pulling back from the monstrous claim. And I just want to talk about 3 things in the book that I thought you and Arendt disagree with, that are meaningful disagreements along these lines. One is, you say, or you raised the question of whether Arendt thought Eichmann was an anti-Semite. I actually think you and Arendt agree on this. I mean, Arendt says, the quotes that you give are all from her presentation of him, from his self-presentation in his early years. And she says in his early years, he's not a Jew hater. His mother had Jewish relations. He implied his Jewish relations helped him. He had a Jewish mistress, we think, or there was rumors of it. I mean, not to say that you can't have a Jewish mistress and be an anti-Semite.
His first successful job, he's employed by a Jew.
And his first successful job, he's employed by a Jew. And so, but what Arendt says is, for whatever reasons, the year 1932 marked a turning point of his life. And at that point, he became a Nazi. And she says he's a joiner. He was as a young person. He was a member of the Jugendherberge thing, and she says at the very end, you admitted the crime against the Jewish people during the war was the greatest crime in recorded history, and you admitted your role in it. But you said you had never acted from base motives. We find this difficult, though not altogether impossible to believe. She doesn't think of course she thinks he's an anti-Semite. She doesn't believe him, but she doesn't. But now that brings it, and by the way, you say in your book, he may have not started out as a virulent anti-Semite, but he absorbed it. I actually think you largely agree. But the second part is, and this is now the more important part, is you say, she says, look, this isn't the issue. You say this is the issue, right? This comes to what you said is anti-Semitism the chain and the link, right? Or not? And you say a couple times, it would take me years to understand that the Holocaust sprung from the self-same soil that kept Jewish kids from top-notch schools. You say the final solution was the outcome of anti-Semitism. You say Arendt submerged the most fundamental and indispensable element of this event. She ignored the bedrock of the Holocaust, the long torturing history of anti-Semitism. Now, I read this, and I think, well, she wrote a whole book, the first book of the Origins of Totalitarianism, called Anti-Semitism. She says in that book that anti-Semitism was crucial to the Nazi ideology. She says that people have minimized the role of anti-Semitism and treated it as accidental, thought of it as simply propaganda, but we need to take it seriously. She says, in fact, I'm going to go and do more research on it, and do a whole chapter on the Dreyfus Affair, and show how important anti-Semitism was in this whole affair. But she says, even though it was, we also have to separate Jew hatred from anti-Semitism. And we have to separate pogroms from a Holocaust. And we have to separate burning villages from a genocide and killing from bureaucratic mass killings. And that there is a common sense fallacy, she says, of eternal anti-Semitism, which leads to the normalization of Jew hatred and excuses it. And we have to be wary of it. Now, people can disagree about that, but she certainly talks about anti-Semitism.
Oh, yeah.
She certainly doesn't sweep it under the rug. I think she makes actually an incredibly powerful argument, right? That anti-Semitism was important, but was not central, right, in the Holocaust. Because she says there were pogroms. That's we have anti-Semitism through history. We shouldn't deny the anti-Semitism, but we have to take seriously that something else is at play. That's her argument, and a lot of her work, all of her work in this area, is trying to figure out what that something else is. Imperialism, other things as well. And I think that's an important distinction between you. But I don't feel like you argue against her. I think you just say she sweeps it under the rug, and I think that's important.
I think in relation to the Eichmann trial, she sweeps it under the rug. I certainly don't think she sweeps it under the rug in the anti-Semitism book. I don't think she sweeps it under the rug in other things. But I think for some reason, when she's looking at Eichmann, she can't acknowledge how deeply the anti-Semitism has become part of what he does. I don't think she diminishes the importance of anti-Semitism, and I don't suggest that, I'm talking about this specific book in relation to the specific trial. I wasn't writing a study of Arendt's views on anti-Semitism in general. And I think she's right. Pogroms are not a Holocaust. The Holocaust was something quite different. It wouldn't have happened without, the famous, probably apocryphal, but the joke that is told about the Nazi era of some Nazi official standing there and saying, and the Jews are our misfortune, and the Jews did this, and the Jews did that, and somebody in the audience yells out, and the bicycle riders. And the guy says, why the bicycle riders? The person says, why the Jews? No, it would never have happened, but I don't even know if the joke was told. But in any case, the point is that without centuries of that anti-Semitism, Eichmann couldn't have come to do what he does. And I just think in her analysis of Eichmann, she somehow can't connect that as much as it deserves to be connected. Here's a man, as I mentioned earlier, in 56, 57, is being taped in Argentina, saying, again, this famous statement, I'm going to go to my grave that I had a role in this killing. This was a man who would, the Foreign Office would say, the Italians are asking about a particular Jew who's married to an Italian Catholic, and her father is a member of the Italian Fascist Party, and they're anxious to find him. Can you locate him? They just want him located. Eichmann would find him and get the guy on the train to a death camp. They would ask about someone, Eichmann would write. So there was a tremendous commitment to doing his job, but a commitment that was motivated by a deep-seated anti-Semitism. And I don't think she diminishes. I wouldn't have taken her seriously. I mean, I wouldn't have, of course, taken her seriously, because so many people take her book seriously that I would have been forced into it. But I don't think she at all diminishes, and her history diminished the importance of anti-Semitism. For some reason, in her depiction of Eichmann, I think she just somehow can't bring herself to acknowledge that. Maybe it's because to do so would somehow run counter to her, theories on totalitarianism. I'm not sure, but that I leave that open.
You know what? I'm going to stop here because we're
dangerously close.
So we got about 25 minutes, and I'm going to throw it open to questions, and we can then talk.
With pleasure.
Julius.
Okay, I have a few comments, and some of them I have personal recollections with Hannah, who was a friend of mine in the 50s and 60s. First of all, you and I must not have read the same book. I read the one that was printed in the New Yorker. Obviously, you added certain things to it that came from other sources. And I don't recognize Hannah Arendt from your description. It's just my opening remarks. Now, going into some details.
But try to keep it short, because we're short on time.
I'll try to keep it short. Thank you, Roger. I don't talk very long. Let's talk about anti-Semitism. You accuse her because of these remarks of anti-Semitism. You have to accuse every German Jew that existed at that time, and there were 600,000 of them. There's a difference between Western Jew and Eastern Jews.
Talking to someone whose name is Lipstadt.
Yeah, excuse me. I grew up in Germany. My family came from the East. I've never been east of Germany, so I've lived in both camps. And some of these remarks that were made were common among German Jews. Let's remember that this was a different time, a different age, and if she made remarks of that type, they were the same thing that we used to say in the 40s and before, which is now politically incorrect. So one has to make a distinction there, and that's extremely important. That's one of the points. That doesn't make her, to call her anti-Semitic or have an anti-Semitic streak of any kind, I don't understand, and it wasn't there. The second thing, I want to talk about her attitude towards Israel. And I've discussed that with length with her and with her husband Heinrich. Their feeling was that the problem between Jews and Arabs were not solvable, and that because of that, the state could not exist. My attitude was that the importance of a Jewish state was more important than the difference between Arab and Jews, and somehow things go together. And I might add to it the jury is still out. The problem hasn't disappeared. That's one of the things that I want to stress here. And I see other points.
Okay.
Let me get one more point out, George. Germany, at the time in the 1930s, anti-Semitism was at a low point. It was at a high point in 1910, and it was at a low point. It was something that the Nazi movement recognized as a means of gaining power, and they perpetuated it. That doesn't mean that that many Germans, once they were caught up by the Nazi issue, became part of the machine. And once they were in there, they couldn't help themselves. They were part of it, and they knew it was a matter of survival. I don't believe there were many Germans who didn't know what was going on. It was going on there. So we have to make that distinction, that being an anti-Semite was only important as far as Nazi philosophy was concerned at that time. It was not endemic in that particular period. And I'm going to stop right there.
And your last point, I never say, first of all, I don't talk about that in in my other work, I don't say that it was endemic. In fact, I think it's more horrifying that many people did it not out of conviction, but out of convenience and participated. I don't believe for a minute that Hannah Arendt was an anti-Semite. I don't know where people get this idea. I would like to say to them...
You said it yourself.
I
heard you say it.
I did not say that she was an anti-Semite, because I don't believe it.
You said
I say that some of the remarks in the book and some in Eichmann and Jerusalem, some of the ways things she expressed come close to sounding like anti-Semitism. To describe her as an anti-Semite is just, I guess there's a personal connection when you can never quite get over that. And in terms of Israel, I also cite in the book what she writes to Mary McCarthy during the Yom Kippur War about how distressed she is with what is going on not just in Israel, but how distressed she is with the anti-Semitism, and I'm paraphrasing here, being expressed at the United Nations towards Israel. So I think she was disturbed. I think she's right. She was right. She was disturbed about the failure to resolve the Arab, Israeli, Jewish issue, etc., etc. In terms of explaining away her comments about about Hausner, he's a Galician Jew who doesn't know any languages, ghetto mentality, about the Israeli police, etc. As typical German Jewish things. I grew up in a very German Jewish household. My father was born in Hamburg, my aunts, cousins, etc. Yes, there was a feeling that German Jews had got it righter than a student, etc. But my father still married a Polish Jew. I get to places on time but out of breath, because I'm a mixed marriage. But what she wrote, even though they were private letters, I still found, for someone of her caliber, and someone of the sensitivity, which I think many in this room feel she had, and the sensitivity toward the human condition, and how people should behave to make the world a habitable place, to read those kind of comments I found shocking. Maybe I'm too sensitive and I should just explain them away, but I couldn't, given the source of evidence.
So we're short on time with Steve.
I'll try to be swift. First of all, Professor Lipstadt, thank you very much. That was thoughtful and eloquent and provocative. And it's very brave of you, even though you face down worse, to come to the Hannah Arendt Center and make remarks that are critical. And I do admire you and acknowledge you for this. Secondly, I'm just made a little uncomfortable that we're talking about the Holocaust and the Jews and not mentioning the Gypsies, the Russians, and other victims of Nazi genocide. Not that Hannah Arendt takes it up so well either, okay, but I just feel it's necessary to put that into this room because we weren't the only victims of
Well,
what
that's a
happened.
complicated issue, and I say in the book that had the Germans won the war, they would have wiped out lots of other people. So they would have finished the job on the Gypsies.
Yep.
They would have wiped out the people, and I don't say this with any derogatory of the stands, you know. They would have wiped out loads of Ukrainians and Lithuanians, etc. Useless eaters, you know. But only for the Jews did it have to be right then and there.
Correct. But okay, so that was the second thing I wanted to say, just because it just bothers me to talk so much about one group and not mention the others that were also very
Well, they
very
weren't.
different.
I think it's different, but that's for another conversation.
Okay. To your point, one of your points that you're making about why Hannah Arendt couldn't bring herself to discuss Eichmann's anti-Semitism. Oh, I'm with you. She was wrong. She got it wrong. In fact, papers that came out much more recently, like in the last 10 years, transcripts of things that Eichmann said when he was in Argentina and so on. And Elizabeth Youngrell spoke about this actually up at Bard. She was wrong. He was much more anti-Semitic than she knew. Okay, but it is curious that she didn't go there, which I think is your point. And I think there is a reason for that, which she talks about in Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is that, you know, Eichmann received his marching orders at the end of July from Heydrich, okay, about what the final solution was going to be. In fact, it was July 31st. I happened to see the document in my head right when he received the document. He doesn't, and he goes on a tour. He goes on a tour to Poland. He sees Auschwitz. He sees several other places, which are just getting going.
Being built.
He is repulsed by it. He comments. He writes letters about it, about how repulsed he is and how sick he is. Yet, in September of 1941, he, with his just impenetrable and implacable insensitivity, begins the final solution and does it, we have to say, very well. I mean, it's disgusting, it's repugnant, but, you know, and so how is it possible that in 4 weeks this man went...
I don't know how repulsed he is when he writes, you know, about that. I have real trouble.
Okay, hang on. But Hannah Arendt is fascinated by this, and she writes very briefly, but then she takes it up later again in Human Condition, when she starts to philosophize about Eichmann. Okay, she takes it up. This point, like, how is it possible that a man goes from being at least expressing, okay, thoughts of this is not right, something's wrong here, to just this, if I may use the phrase, this, you know, automatic, thoughtless behavior. Okay, you know, she ascribes it to his a couple of things. One is his careerism. He was wanting to advance his career, and the other that he was swept along in a tide. You know, where, you know, Himmler had given the speech. We both saw it in Berlin, where he said, you know, this was a duty, and you have to endure.
The Posen speech.
Right.
That's in 43.
Okay. Well, he had given another one. I'm sorry. Okay, not the Posen speech. He'd given a speech in which he talks about how it's your duty to endure the slings and arrows of being an executioner. Blah 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 blah. So, you know, she's very much focused on that. Okay, and talks about how it would have taken an exception to the tide to do the right thing, and this guy was not one of them. Okay, so I just wanted to bring this up in response to